When you know how to create a sourdough starter properly, you're going to possess a really powerful culture that can be used to create some beautiful artisan sourdough loaves. Now, when I first started, I made the mistake of making way too much sourdough starter. I wasted huge amounts of my time and huge amounts of flour. And this is when most home bakers become really frustrated and they quit the process altogether. So I want to save you from all of that waste and the frustration by showing you a simple, proven method that has worked countless times for me and the members of our Sourdough Unchained community. Now, if you want to save some time and avoid re-watching this video several times, you can get a printable recipe guide along with the full method by clicking the link in the video description. Now, sourdough starters absolutely love routine, so you're going to be creating the starter and then feeding it at the same time every single day. You're going to need some digital scales that weigh in grams and a jar that's large enough to hold 300 grams of water. If you've got 3 jars kicking around, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Now, being able to weigh your ingredients accurately is one of the keys to consistently producing amazing sourdough. So if you haven't got any scales, I'd strongly suggest you invest in some. I'm going to link to the My Way scales that I use below. They are by far one of the best choices for the home baker. So let's create our starter. Now, I'm weighing 20 grams of water into my jar. Now, I'm using filtered tap water because that's what we use for drinking at home. But I have successfully made starters using unfiltered tap water. But if you're worried that your water's super chlorinated or it's really hard, then you can feel free to filter it. Now I'm adding in 10 grams of good quality strong white bread flour, followed by 10 grams of stone ground whole wheat flour. I give that mixture a really good stir and then pop the lid on it. That's it. We're going to leave this to do its thing for the next 24 hours. Now, one of the beasts that we really need to battle with anything sourdough related is temperature. If things get too cool, the fermentation may stall. If things get too warm, then that fermentation can really run riot. If you can keep your starter at a temperature of around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, you won't have any temperature related problems whatsoever. Now, you can use something like the Sourdough Home from Brod & Taylor to control the temperature of your starter, but you can easily use a cool box as the chamber and then ice bricks to cool it down or a heating pad to warm it up. This method works great because you can actually use it to ferment your dough when it's time to bake. Now, I checked in on my starter 12 hours after mixing, and while there were a few tiny bubbles, there wasn't much really going on. Right, so the next morning on day 2, we've got some early signs of fermentation, and that is a really good indication that things are going in the right direction for us. So I'm going to grab another jar and then I'm going to add 20 grams of water, 10 grams of strong white bread flour and 10 grams of whole wheat flour. And then I'm going to add 20 grams of yesterday's starter. Now, the starter that I've got left over, that's going to go straight into the bin. It smells and it tastes disgusting. And until I've achieved a safe fermentation, I have no interest in saving it. But the time will come when we're going to use this excess starter to make an amazing recipe, but I'm going to let you know when that time is. Now, that evening, about 12 hours later, there were some really significant signs of activity. So everything's going really well. Right, so the following morning on day 3, everything had kind of settled back down. Now, at this point, the starter smells more like a mixture of paint stripper and vomit that's kind of capable of singeing off your eyebrows as you take a sniff, so be warned. Now, I grab my spare clean jar, I add 20 grams of water, 10 grams of whole wheat flour and 10 grams of strong white bread flour, and then 20 grams of yesterday's starter. The rest goes in the bin. Why? Because it smells and tastes disgusting. We're going to pop a lid on the newly mixed starter and then we're just going to leave it to chill. Now, about 12 hours later, I checked in on the starter, which looked pretty much void of any life, but not surprising as we're only just getting going. Now, on the morning of day 4, not a lot had really changed, and this is the point when most home bakers think that something has gone drastically wrong. We've seen a little bit of action over the first day or two, and now that mixture has turned into kind of an acidic, watery soup. Now, during the first week, most starters go through a dormant stage, and that can last as little as 1 day or up to several days. But don't stress, trust in the process and just keep going. So today it's time to make one adjustment. We're going to cut out the whole wheat flour completely. I'm going to use 20 grams of water, 20 grams of strong white bread flour, and then 20 grams of yesterday's starter. Now, once again, we're going to get rid of those leftovers. Now, around 12 hours later, nothing has happened, and you could be forgiven for thinking that all hope has been lost. But fear not, because by the morning of day 5, we've got a real glimpse of life. The mixture is still loose, but there are foamy bubbles on the surface. Now the starter has kind of lost that ability to strip off my eyelashes, and it's beginning to smell and taste pleasantly sour. Now you know the drill, 20 grams of water, 20 grams of strong white bread flour, and 20 grams of yesterday's starter. Remember, you only want to save the leftover starter when it's been properly fermented. And now is not the time, so this discard is destined for the bin. But things are about to change. Now 12 hours later, just before bed, I was greeted by a very happy looking starter. The texture had become creamy, it was full of bubbles, and it had increased in volume. And by the next morning, on day 6, that starter had dropped in volume. The texture had become watery, but it tasted pleasantly sweet, fruity, and slightly acidic. The difference in aroma from day 2 is like night and day. So now we've achieved a proper fermentation. And you've guessed it, 20 grams of water, 20 grams of strong white bread flour, and 20 grams of yesterday's starter complete our day 6 mix. And now the fermentation is properly underway, I'm going to mark the height of the starter using a marker pen, and that way I can see how much it increases in volume. But from this point on, instead of throwing away our leftover starter, I'm going to pop a lid on the jar and I'm going to keep it in the fridge. I'm going to be sharing a video very soon that's going to show you how to include every last drop of that leftover starter in an amazing hybrid recipe. And just 6 hours later, this is what I was greeted with, a bubbly, vibrant, creamy sourdough starter that tastes fruity and pleasantly sour. Now be warned, because this is where many walk blindly into a fatal trap, and that can cause them to give up baking sourdough completely. Their starter is a week old. They bounce into the kitchen, they knock up their first dough and eagerly slide it into the oven. But instead of being greeted by this well-sprung loaf, they discover a rather flat loaf with a gummy crumb, often scattered with large holes. We need to remember that while we've been feeding the starter for a week, it's only been fermenting properly for a day or so. Now this chart, it shows the pH readings that I took 4 times each day over the first 14 days of creating the starter. You can see that it's not until day 6 that we start to see a consistent pattern in the readings. And Brian, one of our Sourdough Unchained members, had very similar results, with his starter finding its rhythm on days 7 through 8. We need to build strength into our starter. We need to nurture it. So I want you to continue with this feeding routine for at least another 7 days after it's found its rhythm. And then we can start baking. Now in the next video in the series, I'm going to show you how to use your new starter to bake your very first loaf that springs up in the oven, producing an awesome crumb and an outstanding flavour. Stay tuned.